video off if you really don't want to be in a video. And then other order of business, let's keep the chat on topic. Feel free to use the chat to ask questions if you have them, and we'll try our best to pull them in, and sort of the speakers might try to respond and answer as we go. But please no sort of like crosstalk in the chat. All right, well, that being said, again, my name's Alicia, and tonight we're here to talk about the city budget, which just passed over a week ago, and which a lot of DSA comrades on this call and other folks organizing on the left around the city were involved in. So just to set the stage a little bit, why do we as socialists care about the New York City budget? First, because it's a massive distribution of funds, money and resources, always hovering around $100 billion, which is kind of unbelievable. And so we must have a say in how that money's distributed, whether it goes into schools or parks or healthcare, or whether it goes into policing and incarceration. And even more simply, like if that money is spent in the interest of people or in the interest of business, whether it's going to create sustainable jobs for New Yorkers or not. So if you live in New York City, your life is touched by the city budget all the time. If you have a school, if you go to school, or if you have a kid in school, if you're connected in any way to CUNY, the city budget determines trash pickup, park maintenance, summer programs for kids, subsidized Metro cards, how many police are on your block. The city budget also employs over 300,000 people. So many of us are, or will be, or have been city employees, or have city employees in our families. So that is all a pretty incredible organizing opportunity here for DSA. Most New Yorkers know their city council member's name, and they're familiar with the city agencies that touch their lives every day. Even I think much more readily than having familiarity with New York state politics, which is often the terrain that DSA plays on. So specifically, New York City budget is designed to be opaque, confusing. It is stacked to give way more control to the mayor and much less to city council members, and even virtually none, and no visibility or input to regular people like you and me. And so our intervention as socialists is also to be a democratizing force in this budget process, but especially with our current mayor, Eric Adams. My shirt says Eric Adams raised my rent. A bunch of us have these awesome DSA shirts, but it's just, it is a really uphill battle to get anything done, or to get anything that feels like a win with Eric Adams as the mayor. So this year, the mayor started, as usual, with a proposal to dramatically cut like pretty much every agency and every program in the city. And we all spent months trying to claw that back, claw back those cuts so that critical agencies and programs would just like break even. But as socialists, it's kind of frustrating to be playing on that playing field because, for example, we all know public education has been underfunded chronically for decades. So just getting back to a place of no cuts, like that's not our dream. So that's part of our role as DSA, is to be carving out space for folks in the city to imagine what could be possible in a different reality, and then getting ourselves eventually to a budget that we are excited to vote yes on. I know that Tiffany and Alexa, you'll hear more about them soon, both talked in their speeches about the budget, about like what it would take to get them to a yes and how excited they would be to vote yes on a good budget. But for now, we are not at that good budget. And a big part of our project has been growing the power of the left and growing that opposition to Mayor Adams. And this year, we really did see that power grow. As one example, last year, there were only 6 council members who opposed the mayor's budget and voted no on it. And this year, we nearly doubled those numbers, having getting up to 11 progressive no votes. And so that shows something. It is exciting. And you're going to hear more throughout this call about how it all went down from comrades fighting at all different angles. So this is a short call. It's only an hour long. So Stick with us, and I'm first going to pass it to Brian for a breakdown on the actual budget numbers, and then off to Councilmember Tiffany Cabán, and then a couple different DSA members leading campaigns around the city. All right, Brian, take it away.
Sure. Okay, here we go. So we are going to do a lot of numbers really quickly. So the first thing to do when we're talking about budget comparisons is what we're comparing the baseline to. Because so if we have the adopted here in yellow, it's going to look a lot different if we're comparing it to the adopted from fiscal year 22, or the adopted from last year, or the modified, which is the current budget. So the budget changes as it goes through the year, or the executive. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we're doing our comparisons right, or at least citing the numbers right. So over the course of the year, from the adopted fiscal year 23 to the latest one, the adopted fiscal year 24, we have the modified. And the modified actually added a significant amount of spending to the city budget, about $10.1 billion, which is a huge amount of money. The city budget in total is about $100 billion generally. So it's about a 10% increase in funding numbers. So if we leave that out, we are leaving out big chunks. So what does it look like? I think Alicia characterized it well when we went from a pretty terrible executive proposal to a much better adopted budget. So the first thing I want to highlight is this little one called debt service here. Debt service matters because a lot of the funding restorations we saw in the adopted came actually out of the debt service amount. So debt service was reduced from the executive proposal, we can call that the Adams proposal, to the adopted budget by about $2 billion. So when we saw restorations of programs, when we saw restorations of education funding, CUNY funding, a lot of it probably came out of this debt service amount. Now, Adams did an interesting thing when he proposed such a high debt service amount in the first place, because you normally don't see that in proposals. This was the adopted for year 23. But then something interesting is going to happen here in the modified. It shot up to about $7 billion from $2.4 billion. And this is a good reminder that this is not the end of the budget fight just because we have an adopted budget. Okay, it goes on. And when we aren't looking, mayors like to ratchet up this debt service number. This is not an outlier here. This is what we see every time. It shoots up in the modified, goes down in the adopted. So, okay, now let's talk about education. That was the hot topic for the last round. Now, these bars don't look significantly different, but it's a huge amount. Education makes up the largest portion of the city budget every year. So what we saw from the modified, from the adopted to the adopted, if we're just looking here at these two, we see a slight increase, which is great, considering that Adams wanted to cut it by a lot. But, you know, the increase is a little under 500 million. The problem here is that this increase is only about 1.5% increase percentage change from adopted to adopted. And the current rate of inflation, based on the most recent numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is about 3.5 for the New York City region. So if our numbers don't go up by at least the rate of inflation, that's effectively a cut, even if we see a slight increase. So it's not catastrophic. We averted a lot of the worst, it seems here, probably because the council members were, I think, rightly frightened by the response last time. So that's a credit to everyone here and everyone who organizes around this issue. Okay, so for higher education, CUNY saw a disastrous executive proposal. CUNY is funded partially on the state level and on the city level. On the city level, it's mostly the community colleges that are funded, and then a few of the Hunter special schools. So it ended with a net expense budget of about 1.4 billion. It's a slight improvement over the adopted and also over the modified, which is a net win for us. However, again, remember, we want to see at least 3.5% increases, or we're not keeping up with the rate of inflation. The increase here is only 0.5%. So that's not great. Health is a lot worse. So this is where we were in the modified. The modified is the current budget. So the adopted is like the ideal plan for what we're going to hit. It almost always changes over the course of the year in the modified. So we're at 4.9 billion right now. And then in the adopted, we're only at 4 billion. That's a huge decrease. We have a lot of major health problems in the city. We're still in a pandemic, situation, and it's moderately better though than what Adams wanted, which was an executive of 3.9, which would have just been a disastrous cut. We can talk a little bit. I do want to show policing and punishment here, and actually, okay, yes. So this is DOC and NYPD. Now I do want everyone, because this is going to come back later, to notice the large increase from the adopted to the modified. That's the main thing to point out here. There was a large increase in funds for policing, particularly for the NYPD, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And then the last one for this is DHS, because this requires a little bit of explanation. So it would look like, just by going by the numbers, that from the adopted 2.4 to the adopted FY24, 4.1, that looks like a huge increase, right? It's not really, unfortunately, or it's not an increase in the ways that we actually want to see, because the devil is in the details here. When we look at the DHS budget by units of appropriation, so it's broken down into three: shelter intake and programs, administration, and street programs. So looking at the adopted here, FY23, and the adopted here, FY24, we see that the increase is almost entirely in shelter intake and programs, which wouldn't be bad, except this is all to mitigate the asylum seeker crisis. This is probably primarily payments to hotels, things like that, things that aren't taking proactive steps to help a lot of people in constructive ways, and aren't helping the existing homeless population at all, because actually street programs here is cut. So street programs outreach to the existing homeless population is cut. So whenever anyone, I just want to point that out, so that if you hear someone talking about the large increase in DHS's budget, you can kind of correct them, because the increase is coming from the state, it's coming from the federal level, primarily to mitigate the absolute worst of the asylum seeker crisis without offering effective long-term solutions, such as permanently affordable housing. Okay. So we should talk a little bit about adopted budget positions, because one of the more interesting things is, even with the restorations we saw in the executive to the funding levels, we did not see the corresponding restorations in the number of positions. So here we have the Department of Education still losing over 1,000 budgeted positions. These are probably unfilled positions, so people aren't actually getting laid off here, but so in some ways it's more insidious than that, because it's a structural adjustment. These are vacant positions that were planned to be filled, that needed to be filled, and now instead of filling them, they're just eliminating those positions, taking them off the books entirely. So we can't even tell that they are as severely understaffed as they are. This one here, Department of Social Services. Now, this one matters a lot for my job. I work for one of our DSA state electeds, and constituents call our office all the time, looking for help getting connected to city agencies to help them with housing, help them with landlord complaints, help them with all kinds of unemployment issues. We call DSS, we can't get anyone on the phone, or if we do, they're too overworked and burdened to help at all. This is a huge position cut, 899 positions. All in all, trying to get the numbers, I think we lose over 3,000 budgeted positions. 3,875 budgeted positions are lost in this budget. These are positions that should be filled. Their job functions are going to be pawned off onto other agency staffers, and this is a real crisis. Department of Health loses 236 positions. CUNY, even with the funding restoration, loses 235 positions. Department of Buildings, 133. This is serious. These are positions that really need to be filled, and they are not being filled. In fact, they are being eliminated. And so, okay, last slide here. So this is agency cuts compared to the modified, so compared to the current level. Now, I told you that police funding number would come back. This is, we see hey, that looks like a pretty big cut for the NYPD. That's great, right? Not really, because we did see an increase from the adopted to the end of the year in the modified. The NYPD budget went up about $800 million. This is mostly due, I think, a little bit to overtime costs and then to the new contract, back pay, being given out to the officers there. So just short of $1 billion increase. So that should put this in perspective, kind of wipes it off the board entirely. But we're seeing large cuts to Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. That's a huge cut. Fire department, Department of Social Services here, Department of Correction. This is a little bit of a tricky one because yes, we want to reduce funding to the Department of Correction. At the same time, the people who are being held in Rikers are experiencing a humanitarian crisis that is unprecedented in barbarity. So reducing funds there, especially to people coming in and providing health and social services and small comforts to the existing inmate population, this is not going to help them. Health and hospitals also cut. Department of Information get a little bit of, so District Department of Sanitation goes down. This is compared to what we have now. So when we talk about funding levels, we have to make sure we're comparing it to the reality of what we currently have and what this is going to do. HPD, nearly $50 million. So again, it is, as Alicia said, not the worst budget ever in the world. Certainly compared to the mayor's proposal in the executive, it's worlds better. And that's due to the advocacy of a lot of people on this call, to DSA, to People's Plan, to our council members who held strong and even still voted no against a budget they knew was bad, despite moderate funding increases. So on that depressing note, I think I am done with my portion of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Brian. Indeed depressing, but really useful to see the important takeaways that are so often lost in news stories just because this budget is so opaque and confusing every year. But what you're telling us about, like, the dramatic loss of city jobs and positions and agencies that help people, and how, like, given inflation, even just getting agencies back to the budget numbers that they were at a year or two ago really means a cut for some of our important agencies. So this all means worse services and worse programs for the people who need it most. But to hear more about what it was like on the inside dealing with this budget, I'm going to pass it over to Councilmember Tiffany Cabán. As I mentioned earlier, she's one of two of our DSA socialist in office in the city council, who just won her re-election race very handily. So congrats to you, Tiffany. Our electoral project is a huge part of DSA's success, and one of the reasons why we've been able to agitate and build a bigger left bloc in the council is by having people like Tiffany Cabán and Alexa Aviles in there, like bringing their colleagues along with them, giving them the courage to do what they do. And we've got 8 other socialists in office in the state legislature. So it's a pretty exciting place to be. So stay tuned for more on that. But Tiffany, why don't you take it away?
Awesome. Hey, y'all. Tiffany Cabán, pronouns are she, her, council member in the 22nd, and member of the Queens branch. So I'm just going to take some time to kind of like demystify the budget process and how we experience it, and then talk a little bit about priorities and strategy throughout the process. So brief overview of the city budget process. And if you've been on one of these budget debriefs before, you might be a little bit familiar with it. But essentially, right, we're working on a fiscal year, July 1 to July 1. And it starts, early on in the year with the mayor in, January something, whatever, releasing a preliminary budget. The second, after the preliminary budget is released, then, we do a whole series of hearings, budget hearings. So every committee is doing these joint hearings with finance where all the council members get an opportunity to ask questions, but it is just like a massive number. It's just marathon hearings, hours and hours and hours, completely impossible to juggle them all, to attend them all, to be present for all of them. Sometimes they're happening at the same time. And then from there, there's like, the council will put forth their official response, basically like outlining what their priorities are. And then there's an executive budget that's released. We do another set of hearings on the executive budget. It culminates in this like day-long hearing of just OMB, so the big finance hearing, followed by the big public hearing, which I'm sure there are folks on here who testified that hearing started in the morning and it went until like midnight, and that's what happens pretty much every year. But the important thing to know about this process is that in New York City, and New York State, we are a very executive-heavy government. Right? Like we put a lot of power in the hands of our executives, whether it is the mayor or the governor, which is not the case in every municipality or state or jurisdiction. And when you have a mayor like Eric Adams, it's pretty awful. So that's like the really fast and dirty budget process itself. I want to talk about the aspects of the process that are sort of like undemocratic or opaque or make it difficult for us to represent our constituents. And to do that also takes a little bit more time, like talking about internal structures. But this particular structure is something that has not always been the case. I think it started with former Speaker Chris Quinn. She started the BNT, the budget negotiating team, which is essentially just a group of the speakers, favored council members that basically get to be a bit more at the table and know what's going on with the budget. It's, maybe a dozen or less council members. You can pretty much guarantee that myself and Alexa and the lefties were not on the budget negotiating team. And it's a way and an opportunity for those folks to really make sure that they get to put forth their priorities and have them heard more often than not. And in theory, right, like the BNT, the budget negotiating team, is supposed to be sort of like a conduit or liaise with other members so that, we're all staying in touch with what's happening with budget negotiations. That doesn't happen. It's not a thing. And you really have to do your own kind of organizing or organize members of BNT. Like we do all these budget hearings and we meet with aligned groups and they'll be like, well, what can we do to get this funded? What's the next step? And be like, target some members of the BNT because I don't have a seat at the table. And that's sort of what we end up doing. And then even then, if you're on the budget negotiating team, you don't know a whole lot. You don't know what's in the budget before you vote on it. The other thing too is that there's not a good tracking. So I mentioned that we have all of these hearings and we're not being provided with sort of really good documents, whether they're in our briefings that we're having in our Democratic conference or otherwise, around what changes are being made at any given time. We do a few like very quick in the days before, basically when it's really close to a handshake between the mayor and the speaker. We do a series of Democratic conferences where they talk about the things that they won, right? And a question that I asked in those meetings were, okay, these are the things that you say that you got concessions on or restored, but where are the cuts? What does everything else look like? I want to see the budget. And it's different from the state budget because in the state budget, they're bills and they go line by line in conference, and it takes hours and hours and hours. But every single state legislator knows exactly what's in the budget because they take the time to talk through them for these marathon sessions. That does not happen with us. We get a tiny snapshot, and the only way to be able to get a better picture of what's happening, and it's not even guaranteed to be all that accurate, is saying, hey, I'm going to take the executive budget, this huge ass document. I'm going to take the concessions that the speaker's office, the council side staff, the finance team is saying that they got, and I can overlay and cross-reference and kind of get the gist of what the budget will look like when it passes. I got a physical copy of the entire budget less than an hour before we were voting on it. It's just impossible for any single member to know what's in the budget before they vote on it. So it's really fucked up. And then what you find too is that, right, like the institution has every incentive to pass the budget. And so historically what happens is that there's chip trading, right? In exchange for yes votes, people will make deals to bring like extra goodies into their district, whether it's extra funding for capital projects, whether it's getting your groups in your district funded in speakers initiatives so that you essentially have a bigger pot than your $5 million discretionary, and they'll try to peel people off before to make sure that we have there are enough votes for it to vote. And then you want a large number of votes. You don't want it to like barely scrape by and pass for a whole host of reasons. So that's kind of what happens when you vote no. Historically, typically, the idea is that you don't get a lot of the other things that other members get, and that even you get punished. Now, I will say that this speaker has been less sort of intense in terms of, she's not a Corey Johnson, she's not a Christine Quinn, where there were like really, really nasty repercussions for voting no, although there was some stuff that went down last year that I think is important to put into context our larger organizing project and the progress that we have made in a year's time. Because I know that there are some folks out there that want to spin a story or tell a story that the body itself is losing its leftist power. We lost Charles Barron, Kristen Richardson Jordan, resigned and isn't going to be in the body again. But I will say that I am hopeful because we have made leaps and bounds. So some of the things that were really important to how the vote ended up this year and how we got a less shitty budget. One, we made the Progressive Caucus smaller. And that was important for a couple of different reasons. The Progressive Caucus was so big, it was basically almost everybody in the Democratic conference, and nobody could agree on an agenda, nobody could agree on priorities. And not only that, but there were literally people in leadership in the Progressive Caucus, and there were people who were there to be obstructionist. And so there was a bylaws committee that was put together. I was part of the bylaws committee to rewrite the bylaws, and the goal was to, we aren't an identity caucus. It's not like the Black, Latino, and Asian caucus or the queer caucus or whatever else. We are an ideology-based caucus, and it was for the leadership to define what that meant. You couldn't just say you're a progressive and be in the Progressive Caucus, which a lot of people like to do, like to play it on both sides. So we rewrote those, and I will say the one piece of credit that I will take is that which will come as no surprise to folks, is that the line of the new bylaws that had everybody running out of the Progressive Caucus was the line of the bylaws I wrote, which was great. And that had to do with shrinking the size and scope of NYPD in favor of building out robust public health and public safety infrastructure. And so being able to make it smaller, we were able to put together a list of priorities, right? We prioritized housing, mental health. Now, in its new birth, I mean, I will say there's a lot to go in terms of what the Progressive Caucus has the potential to do. I don't think that the Progressive Caucus was in a position to run a really like hardline budget campaign, but they were really important. What you saw was when the Progressive Caucus put forth what their area priorities were and some of the things they wanted to invest in, those things showed up in the council's response to the mayor's budget. And so it helped create what the benchmarks were. And that was in conjunction with, in partnership with the People's Plan, who were providing this external pressure on saying, like, listen, this is what working class, you know, the multiracial working class of New York demands in terms of their budget. Another thing that's really important, I know I'm probably running out of time here, but another thing that's really important to talk about from last year that affected what happened this year and added to what I view as a huge success was that 6 people voted no last year. And of course, myself and Alexa Aviles, the 2 DSA electeds, were 2 of those 6. Now, when we voted no, there was backlash. There are lots of different stories and versions around how it went down, or whether, you know, the speaker side meant to do it or not. But we voted no, and we saw here a story of the Boys and Girls Club get defunded by $150 grand, and some other little things that then didn't really seem to be a thing. Like there's this thing called Schedule C that shows all the discretionary funding and stuff like that for groups. And what they do is it's kind of petty actually, is that like if you vote no, your name doesn't show up in Schedule C. So you have to like look harder to see if your shit is there. And so if you take a first glance and you're not seeing it until an hour before the budget, you take a first glance and you might say, I can't find these groups that I requested to have funded in this document, but it's harder to find because your name's not there, because they don't want to give you, you know, public credit for the disbursements, the funding. Really petty, but it caused a lot of problems, because then even though there was that piece of punishment, we also thought that there was further punishment because our names weren't anywhere and there wasn't time to like really check it. But anyway, we went into like full on offensive when this happened. I tapped our comrade at the congressional level, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and other aligned groups to kind of put forth a narrative of saying, this is unacceptable. We voted no on principle. This was a bad budget. We shouldn't be punished. And the blowback, the public narrative was so powerful for us that not only was that money immediately restored, but it was a boon for the Boys and Girls Club, because she did fundraising for them. There was a lot of attention around it. And so they got a whole new base of not just national, but international donors, where they kind of came out on top a little bit. And it really sent the message that if you hit us, we will hit back, and we will hit back harder. And so what we saw from the then to now was that there was going to be a calculation before some of these like old school tactics and strategies were used. So this time around, what you saw, and I think that this is just such a beautifully powerful, amazing thing, is that we had, instead of 6 members vote no, 11 progressive or leftist members vote no. And none of those folks were punished. And so what we did was over this period of time, and even the way that we navigated being in relationship with like the regrettable no's, the people who voted no, publicly the pressure was on. And so they publicly said, like, we regret our vote. This was the wrong vote. Those people, we created an environment and helped cultivate an environment along with our partners on the outside to make it safer for them to vote no. And so while yes, for sure, there are people who vote yes that got extra goodies. And if you saw in the news, Julie Menon and Keith Powers got, a lot of extra money in capital funding because, the Upper East Side needs it. But it was just an entirely different experience for all of us. And so I think that that's really powerful. And I want to just take and finish up by taking a moment to honor and give flowers to the SIO committee, to the Socialists in Office committee, because we would not have been able to execute this strategy to make sure that many people, that we grew the no base, that we were able to own a narrative, that we were going to say that there is momentum, and we're going to move this year over year to get closer to the people's budget that we deserve, is because consistently the SIOs were the council members that were able to go into Democratic conference, that were able to go into talking to their colleagues, knowing the numbers more than anybody else. And that has everything to do with folks like Brian Keppel and the other members of the SIO. I talked to members who were trying to understand the numbers. They wanted to be able to vote no, but wanted to be able to say something really concrete about the parts of the budget that really mattered in their district. And it was the night before the vote. And, Brian was up just that idea, or that thing that I told you earlier around having to take the executive budget and then go through our concessions and like cross-reference them and figure out where it is and then look at the vacancies and look at all these different things. He was doing that like late at night, the night before, so that I could then take that information to my colleagues and say, hey, here's what you need to be able to say the thing so that you could vote no, right? Being able to do the outside organizing and kind of pinpointing who was on the fence, who could we solidify, and asking the People's Plan to put pressure, asking other organizers or organizations that we knew held weight with certain members to double and triple, do 2, 3, 4 touches to make sure that we held it down. I mean, the morning of, even down to the littlest things, like you'd be surprised how much this matters. And it mattered last year and it mattered this year, but like even getting all of the people who we had came to an agreement that we were going to vote no, making sure that we all got together for breakfast the morning of, because being able to sit at that table, being able to talk about your fears, being able to get your anxieties out, being able to have comrades and people lifting you up and congratulating you and giving gratitude, like that fortifies you to go in there and vote no and vote strong and be really clear in that messaging. And so I just want to give a lot of credit to Alexa and all of the other folks that voted no. And I think we should not waste it. And we did also, some of us did also, I want to thank the People's Plan for the work that they did. There was a lot of like last minute pressure that had to be sort of navigated together, right? Like to navigate tension, to go through urgent, hard moments together, to say, hey, we need you guys to call for a no vote so that we can do the thing internally. But these things are things that I don't think have really happened to this degree and with this kind of intention and with this level of discipline. And we are far from where we need to be, but I am super, super hopeful about what we're building and how we're building it. And I will say that DSA and the SIO and the organizing that we do year round, not just around the budget, are key parts of how all of this comes together. So I hope that was helpful. I hope it was informative. And I appreciate y'all.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Very helpful and informative. And there have been a lot of great questions and a lot of great answers in the chat. So everyone, please keep that going. Maybe if we can just ask you one quick question. I'm sure the answer is complicated, but just a couple of people have been asking in the chat about like, what can the city council do to like force the process to look different? Could the city council change the budget and make a different one from what the mayor proposes? Could the city council force the process to give you more time to actually read the budget? And so like, I think those are all in the same camp, and just curious, couple sentences.
I'm glad that that's actually a great question, because that was something that I had made a note to myself that I wanted to mention. There are a few things that we could do. We tried to do this last time and we tried to pick it up this time, but admittedly didn't do a good enough job organizing it. And so now we have another opportunity to do it. But After last year's budget, we, some of us had signed a letter saying, we need to see a budget at least 72 hours in advance of the vote. We need a transparent process. We need to know what we're voting on. And so we tried to bring back that demand again, but we could not get sort of like the Progressive Caucus to own it. And it just fell apart a little bit as being a demand. And then there was sort of the sentiment that like it didn't seem possible at the juncture that we were trying to push it. The other thing too is that I think this is really a really important distinction between city and state. When the state budget is late, shit shuts down. Like nobody's getting paid, and there really is that added pressure and urgency to making sure that the budget gets passed on time. A lot of people don't know that is not the case in the city. The budget is late, people's paychecks are still coming out, right? Until a new budget is passed. Now, it gets a little bit complicated and technical after that, because the council can force and leverage a late vote. Are they willing to is a really good question. And is it worthwhile is another really good question, because what happens when the budget is late on the city level is then at some point it gets taken out of our hands and the state comes in. There's a board that then like will draft up a budget. Now, it doesn't happen right away. So you could force a late budget and it takes at least a couple of weeks for that to even happen. And so there's a couple of weeks of a window where in theory, the council could go back to the negotiation table with the administration to like eke out some more changes to the budget.
Cool. Okay, thank you. So it sounds like there's a little bit of, it's an organizing problem, as everything is, to get folks inside the council ready to wage these fights, and also a little bit of overcoming some of the fear of the unknown of like, what happens when we push these boundaries. All right. Well, we will stay tuned. And as someone put in the chat, wondering how DSA's significant member base can support y'all to change the way the budget process works. So we'll be here, we'll be ready. All right, well, thank you again so much. I am now gonna pass it over to Claire, who was one of the leaders of DSA's city budget campaign, to talk about what it was like on the ground, on the outside, and how we made it all happen.
Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Claire. Like Alicia said, I've been a field lead in Queens and in Sunnyside for the city budget campaign, along with some other comrades who may be on this call. We've been out canvassing and tabling for about 5 weeks leading up to the budget fight, and we'll talk about that in a second. But just a little bit of background on the campaign itself. You've already heard that last year's budget was a disaster. There was only marginal opposition to austerity in the city council beyond our DSA members, Tiffany and Alexa. So this year we wanted to run a campaign to challenge the mayor's austerity agenda. Last year, several council members voted yes on the budget without having had time to read it. We've heard this is an incredibly anti-democratic and opaque process. And they didn't realize that the budget was going to kind of like drastically cut funding for schools, education. These council members later publicly apologized for their votes. And so we wanted to harness the popular pressure that forced these council members to do that and use it this year to kind of fight back against an austerity budget. So in April, an ad hoc kind of campaign came together to do exactly that. We targeted 3 council members in particular, Keith Powers in Manhattan, Rita Joseph in Flatbush, Julie Wan in Queens. You already heard we ran a campaign as part of the People's Plan, which is this big coalition and includes Working Families Party, Make the Road, New York Communities for Change, Vocal New York, and other major progressive organizations in the city. The coalition urged council members to vote no once the agreed upon budget was released. Obviously, the budget passed anyway. But the no vote came because preliminary analysis showed that the budget would cut CUNY, social, mental health, homeless services, programs for incarcerated people at Rikers, and more things that people rely on. So while the 3 council members we targeted ultimately did vote yes on the budget, We think the coalition's pressure made the cuts less severe than the mayor had proposed. It's obviously important to remember that the mayor establishes this playing field and that bringing funding back to the baseline is not sufficient, especially when city services and agencies are already stretched so thin that they can't even effectively serve New Yorkers. Next slide, please, comrade. Cool. So our field strategy was focused on tabling rather than kind of traditional door-to-door canvassing. Although we targeted 3 specific council members, ultimately we really wanted to publicly identify ourselves as the opposition to Mayor Eric Adams, and on the side of working people in New York City fighting his cuts. We did this with really big confrontational, agitational signs on our tables that read Eric Adams is defunding New York. People loved them. Distributing literature with the same message, and then asking folks to sign letters to their council members demanding that they oppose his cuts to services and agencies that all of us rely on. Ultimately, we got about 1,000 letters across the 3 different districts, and we either mailed these to council members or we hand delivered them on the eve of the budget vote. So the campaign demonstrated our organizing strength in these districts, and it allowed us to bring pressure on council members we had previously not engaged with. It also prepared us to continue organizing in their districts to make additional wins for working people. In Sunnyside, for example, we're going to continue to build power by canvassing for the Secure Jobs Act, which you're going to hear more about from Ella very soon. So how was this received in the field? People were immediately supportive based almost purely on their opposition to the mayor. Based on the initial opposition, we had a lot of conversations with people about how difficult it is to live and just to get by in New York City, how these proposed cuts come after decades of disinvestment in all areas of public and civic life. We also talked to a lot of DC 37 members, a lot of other city workers, who are already pretty politicized by attempts to privatize and wreck the care that they've earned and been promised by the city, for retirees at least, and who have already seen how harmful the Adams administration's cuts have been to their workplaces. The Adams administration has made it pretty miserable to be a city worker right now by underfunding departments, by sustaining and, as we saw, ultimately eliminating workplace vacancies, attempting to privatize Medicare for retirees, and ultimately eliminating union jobs through this kind of like years-long war of like hostile attrition. People that we talked to really recognize that the cuts were not just to services that New Yorkers need to just survive, but also to institutions that give people resources to learn, to grow, to build real community in the city. I spoke to like a retired social worker who had told me that she went to Hunter for free, years and years ago. And lamented that this is like no longer an option for New Yorkers, for many New Yorkers at least. She knew like exactly what entitlements have been wrested away from us over like generations of disinvestment and what's at stake in a budget fight every year, and especially in this year. Again and again, we found people were eager to talk about how a program that doesn't just reject austerity, but actually allows New Yorkers to enjoy the abundance that we've helped create would provide a more joyful and dignified life for working people across the city. We did encounter, unfortunately, a lot of people who had been, who had adopted the mayor's reprehensible lie that cuts to services were needed to support the influx of migrants seeking asylum in New York City. As we all know, this narrative, which pits working people with citizenship against migrants seeking safety and a better life, also just conveniently kind of obscures the fact that thousands of shelter beds remain empty, that some migrants have endured really inadequate and horrible conditions without showers and heat. And it's nonsense. And we're not going to adopt such a line. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Overall, though, I was really surprised by the strength of the popular sentiment against the mayor. Several times every single canvas, people would just walk up to the table and ask where to sign, what to do. They love the signs, like, what's the date? Give me a pen. And I think they're really heartened by the open opposition to the mayor. The signals that there's like a widespread feeling, I think, of disappointment and anger about his administration, even from people who, thought they were going to support him at the beginning. Our work then as DSA, as socialists, is to organize that feeling into progressive and left opposition that will make him a one-term mayor. This campaign was a really important part of starting that work and demonstrating DSA's seriousness and ability to fight back against the mayor. People were really excited to engage with us. And I think part of that sentiment comes from like a sense of relief to see that there's public displays of opposition to the mayor. It reflects the relative disorganization of that opposition, but it also shows us that people are really ready to be organized into that struggle. This campaign was an important step in doing that. In the future, I think there's a real opportunity for the coalition to put forward a positive vision of what the city could and should be doing for the people who make it run, and not just opposing austerity and cuts. And I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Claire. I certainly was motivated seeing those big agitational posters on the tables. So yeah, really excited to see how this grows next year. I'm going to pass it to Meeks to tell us a little bit about CUNY and how this is all connected.
Hello, everyone. I'm Meeks Samuel. She, they pronouns. I'm a junior at CUNY Baruch College, majoring in public affairs and public policy, and co-chair of the New York City DSA New Deal for CUNY campaign. So with over 225 students spanning 25 campuses, including senior colleges, community colleges, graduate schools, CUNY represents both the diversity and possibility of New York City, with a large portion of the undergraduates being people of color and 80% coming from New York City public schools. 50% of the households who also attend CUNY earn under $30K a year. Eric Adams is a CUNY alum of CUNY City Tech and CUNY John Jay. From universal pre-K to K through 12 in CUNY, it's being affected by the program to eliminate the gap, PEG. Cuts to CUNY throughout the last fiscal year under Adams led to the loss of 235 faculty and hiring freezes. And PEG proposed $41 million in annual cuts between fiscal year 2024 to 2026. So CUNY community colleges, like those listed on the screen, including BMCC, Queensborough, Bronx Community College, LaGuardia, Hostos, Kingsborough, they primarily get their funding from the city, which threatens a lot of programs. So like Accelerate Study Associate Program and Accelerate Complete and Engage. These programs promote educational equity, including free tuition and scholarships, academic advisement, extra academic advisement, and free Metro cards and transportation. So next slide. Through the efforts of CUNY students in YDSA, PSC CUNY, the Professors Union, and CUNY Rising Alliance as a whole, we restored through $32.4 million in cuts to community colleges and a restoration to critical programs like CUNY ASAP and ACE. These programs are constantly on the chopping block every single fiscal year and budget debate, and it should not be like this. Students and faculty in our institutions are physically still feeling the impacts from austerity budgets and the cuts from the years past. So in multiple CUNYs, it takes months to get an academic advisor. The majority of professors are adjunct professors, meaning that they get paid per class and are not paid a living wage. There's a lack of job security with many of these jobs, including that you can be added on to teach another class, or your class can be cut completely. And that is a life and death situation. Like, for example, my brother, when he went to Kingsborough, he met one of his professors who was living in a car because she couldn't afford housing. And that was before the pandemic. Think about that. Elevators on certain floors are not working, with wait times for the elevators being as long as half an hour. On Wednesday, the Newman Vertical Campus at Baruch was evacuated due to a power fluctuation, which resulted in a drop in water pressure, air conditioning, and other system issues. So in the last week, we had rates of heat that's not been seen before across the globe. At Hunter, there's rats around buildings, and a lot of schools that have older infrastructure are physically crumbling and hurting students. So with all of that, what is New Deal for CUNY, by the way? So New Deal for CUNY is a bill on the state legislature that is fighting for a CUNY that is fully funded tuition free as it was before, because CUNY used to be free for everyone. Living wages for faculty and staff, funding for infrastructure improvements, including the broken ports in classrooms and in the library. Mental health advisors is also a big issue on campus, and academic advisors, as I said. So if you're interested in getting involved, bring your efforts in. This is a student-led campaign, by the way. The majority of the people on our steering committee for this campaign is students from various CUNYs. We are looking for people who are interested in taking on admin tasks, and if you have mentorship skills, like maybe have experience in student organizing, please fill out the bit.ly link, dsaforcuny.nyc/signup, dsaforcuny.nyc/signup. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, I can take them.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it to our last presenter for the evening, Ella, to talk about the Secure Jobs Act. And I won't take any more time. Ella, take it away.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Ella. I am co-chair of New York City DSA's Union Power campaign. And as part of Union Power, we are leading the fight for the Secure Jobs Act. And Tiffany Cabán is our prime sponsor. And this act would establish just cause rights for all New York workers, meaning that you can't get fired without a good reason. And we all know that the favorite tool in the boss's box is retaliatory firings to prevent unionization and prevent workers from standing up for themselves. So we have done a lot of joint tabling with the city budget campaign, and that's for two reasons. One of them is that a lot of our targets in the city council are the same. And when you think about it, it's not a surprise that the same people who don't want to stand up for secure jobs and for workers' rights also don't want to stand up against austerity in the city budget. And so there was a really natural connection between our campaigns. The second is because the city budget tabling really strengthened the Secure Jobs campaign. When people saw that we were organizing against budget cuts and against Eric Adams, that lent a lot of credibility to our Secure Jobs ask as well. People trusted that if we were fighting against austerity, then the other things that we were organizing for would also be good for working people. So it was like, sign against the city budget. Oh, and I absolutely will sign for Secure Jobs as well, and tell me more about it, please. So it just goes to show that when we stand up against austerity, it can strengthen our project as a whole. Now, what we're doing going forward, one of our most important coalition partners in the Secure Jobs campaign and most committed coalition partners is Teamsters Local 804, which is in the midst of an incredibly historic contract fight at UPS. They represent 8,000 UPS Teamsters in the New York area. And all 8,000 of those Teamsters are ready to go on strike on August 1st if UPS does not provide them a fair and strong contract. And so we're doing joint tabling with Secure Jobs and UPS Solidarity for July, or for as long as it takes to get a good contract. So this weekend we'll be doing solidarity tabling and like joint Secure Jobs and solidarity tabling, especially in Sunnyside. And on the 23rd, we'll be doing a canvas in Upper Manhattan for Secure Jobs. And so go to that QR code to join our Solidarity Updates chat, where we will be announcing the tabling and other solidarity updates. For example, this Friday, there's going to be a big rally in Brooklyn with Sean O'Brien, the general president of the Teamsters Union, in addition to this weekend's tabling for Secure Jobs and UPS Solidarity. So get into that chat. It is announcements only, so you will not be getting a billion messages. It's just announcements when something is going down so that you can stay updated. And if you want to join that canvas on the 23rd for secure jobs in Upper Manhattan, just go to that bit.ly. It would be great to have you all involved. And I'm excited to keep building both for workers' rights and for a budget that that workers in New York City deserve. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much. I was just at a number of Union Power events last week that were all like so energizing and exciting. So come out, support. All right, I'm going to close this out. We're a little over time, so thanks for everyone who stuck with us. First, I'm just going to drop a couple of things in the chat. That was DSA's statement on the budget if you want to read it, but most importantly is this link. Really just want to say thanks to everyone who presented today, and also everyone who worked really hard this year to fight for a better city budget. Ultimately, like every year we do this fight around the city budget, but there's also the larger story arc of destroying Eric Adams's credibility and his ability to govern, and growing the opposition to him, like among New Yorkers, like Ella was talking about and Claire was talking about in the street, and also in the council, so that we're able to actually make progress enacting the left-leaning policies and budgets that we all care about. And so we're working on that fight to ensure that he's a one-term mayor and that we don't have to fight so hard every single time for the things that we all deserve. So the way we win all of those things and more is by getting organized. So join DSA if you're not a member. If you are a member, come to a meeting, come to a canvas. Really excited to see you out in the streets. All right, thanks everyone for a great evening together. I think that's it. Good night.